This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
I'd like to welcome a very special guest today, Michael Knox Beran, author of WASPs, The Splendor and Miseries of an American Aristocracy. Michael Knox Beran is the author of several books, including Forge of Empires, 1861 to 1871, and The Last Patrician, which both look like wonderful books. He is a contributor for City Journal, The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, and The National Review. Now, WASPs tells the story of one of the most enigmatic and important groups of people in American history due to the stories of individual WASPs. These are the types of stories I love talking about on Beyond the Big Screen, big personalities with incredible backstories that all tie together. Now, I have to just say for the record, I am personally far from being a WASP in just about every imaginable way. So this book and conversation, I think, is really going to help me understand this group much more. I think maybe before, just to set the stage just a little bit before we go on, what is your definition of WASP that you're working with?
Well, it's funny. The word WASP itself, white Anglo Saxon Protestant, is ridiculously overbroad and applies to millions of people. I guess on my mother's side of the family, I would be a WASP because they were from the British Isles, but they weren't WASPs in this sense. WASPs in this sense were a close-knit group of families that were related to each other, that typically had been descended from early elites in the early American Republic, but who after the Civil War found themselves overshadowed by a new power elite, plutocrats, party bosses, who to them didn't share the same ideals, the same principles, who were somewhat leading the old families out in the cold in terms of power, but also valuing a different approach to life, which the WASPs thought narrow and shallow, and they would have said vulgar. In fact, I've just been sent a new, very interesting book to read on the Vanderbilt family. They embodied the newcomers who, after the Civil War, had the money and the power, and the WASPs found them not just vulgar in their snobbish sense, although that was certainly part of it, but they found them narrow, that they were interested in nothing more than money and maybe their yachts and their parties. The WASPs wanted to develop more sides of their personality. This was really crucial to what they were about. They didn't want to lounge around their clubs and, as in the case of Theodore Roosevelt's brother, Eliot, drink himself to death with no purpose, no larger meaning in life. So you find them really trying to be civic generalists, cultivating different aspects of their personality. They took a great interest in public service at a time when gentlemen were not going into politics as much as they had been in the past. They started schools trying to broaden horizons of young, well-to-do people, prepare them for public service, and to prepare them to lead lives in which they would be interested in reform, in broadening their own possibilities. This is very much what the WASPs were about, was avoiding what they saw as the increasing narrowness of modern life.
Yeah, I think that's what really it sort of refined and changed my idea of what a WASP was, especially in this area of education. And you really talk about education as one of their key achievements. For example, you discussed the founding of Groton. Can you talk about the WASP's impact on education and even what that influence that still hangs around to today?
What the founders of some of these prep schools, the feeling that students weren't getting a broad enough education. Their idea was to sort of revive an older idea. We call it now a classical or humane education, which sort of becomes synonymous with just learning Greek and Latin. That was part of it, but I think the really important idea was that you would be prepared through your education to be somewhat, to conduct yourself somewhat in the way, or model yourself somewhat in the way that citizens of an older society like Athens did, where you would be a citizen. You would also train your body through sports. You would also be a soldier. You had to multitask in these older communities because they were less specialized. The idea of some of these WASP institutions is that you could take, admittedly, an elite, create sort of fancy playgrounds for them where they would cultivate all these different things through sports, through learning, through poetry, through particularly the use of music, which the Greeks believed was the way you reach the soul most deeply, is to expose young people to different kinds of music and poetry. And that was really revived in places like Groton. It bit deep and had a great effect in producing a number of the leaders of what I've come to think of as the WASP revival that sort of followed the Gilded Age. Theodore Roosevelt sent all his children there and was almost going to teach there because he was a friend of the headmasters, Endicott Peabody, who founded it. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt graduated from Groton in 1900, and other distinguished cold warriors, Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman, FDR's top diplomat, Sumner Welles, went there. Then, of course, it would later go south during the Vietnam War when George Bundy was advising John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, but that's sort of at the tail end of the story, I guess.
It's interesting, the educational aspect, and it kind of ties together with another theme that seemed to go through the book of the conflict between the WASPs and the plutocrat robber barons that you had discussed. And in a lot of cases, these people were from the same families or from the same groups. What's kind of the division that you draw between the plutocrats and the robber barons and the WASPs in the sense that you're using the term?
The WASPs, Henry Adams, the Roosevelts, Edith Wharton would be part of that group. They were conscious of being descended from pedigreed old colonial and early Republican families that had done well. The plutocrats were newly risen, such as the Vanderbilts. Commodore Vanderbilt was born around 1794 and was not part of the old colonial elite, even though his family had been in the country since the 1700s. And they were looked upon by somebody like Edith Wharton as vulgar. She said they seemed to be just lodged in bad taste that there's no getting them out of. So that was sort of the initial division, that you have these somewhat bitter and resentful people like Henry Adams resenting the fact that these new people are more dominant than they were in a country that Adams, his ancestors, John Quincy Adams and John Adams, the first president, had led. So there was that bitterness that was part of it. And I think part of the idea of the WASPs was that they were going to revive themselves and sort of get even with the newcomers. But at the same time, their institutions were also devoted to assimilating the newly rich so that you would create an elite that would be based on the broad-souled and civic ideals that the WASP reformers wanted, but that they would take in and assimilate families, the new money like the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. And that's in fact what happened. So they eventually became a almost indistinguishable WASP elite by the early 20th century. But there were those divisions after the Civil War, definitely.
I'm thinking like the Roosevelts, their families, if I'm not mistaken, were of a Dutch stock. So it's like the kind of this WASP definitely is more of an ideal than just a genetic or cultural background. Very much
so. I mean, the Roosevelts, it would be Anglo-Dutch because Franklin Roosevelt had as much English blood in him, more so probably than Dutch. But you're right. It really is not a matter of blood. It was this ideal that people like Henry Adams had, that the founders of some of these schools like Groton had, that you should try and do justice to sort of an ideal of human completeness, which was a great preoccupation of intellectuals in the 19th century, Matthew Arnold or Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin. They believed that the modern age was sort of shrinking people's horizons. They were becoming more narrowly focused, partly because the economy was changing the skill sets you needed. You know, you could once have, you look at some of the founders who would be eminent in law and politics, who would be farmers at the same time. They would be multitaskers. But by the 1880s, with the Industrial Revolution, you are specializing. You are doing a job, usually from 9 to 5, that's pretty narrow. The WASPs resisted that. So the ideal does become doing sort of justice to the whole personality. It later became sort of reduced to the, trivial idea of just being well-rounded. But it was really an idea of human completion, and it came to touch people that were in no way genetically WASP. Bernard Berenson at Harvard was deeply influenced by it and became one of the major art connoisseurs of the 20th century. So it was by no means, you're right, no means a purely genetic thing.
Getting into, you've talked a lot about you talk a lot about in the book, but also about some of these individuals, but they were a part of family groups, and the Brahmins is something that I find absolutely fascinating and hard to wrap my mind around. Who were these Brahmin families?
They were New England elites. The term was coined by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the writer, not his son, the Chief Justice, who spoke of Boston Brahmins. And they were, as he understood it, sort of at once a business, but also an intellectual caste that he found typical of some of the great old Boston families that had been doing business in Boston since the colonial period. They were all related to each other, but they also took an interest in the arts, in civic ideas, and they sort of embodied that in the earlier 19th century. But after the Civil War, they were very much overshadowed by a new elite, embodied by people like the Vanderbilts or Jay Gould, Rockefellers, and they wanted to make their descendants, Henry Adams, wanted to sort of find a new way to realize the old Brahmin ideals in a different age.
How had these Brahmins, were they still wealthy at this time, just not as wealthy as some of the new industrialists? They
were very rich, particularly the Brahmins, because they were so frugal. Unlike the Vanderbilts, they lived in townhouses generally. They didn't build these big Fifth Avenue chateaus. They put their money in trust. All kinds of jokes about how frugal they were. They might have millions of dollars, but they would carefully, save, go miles out of their way to get to buy goods cheaper than they could around Boston. All kinds of Yankee frugality involved in them. But they were well off, yes, just not as well off as the new rich industrial plutocrats. Although eventually the families sort of intermarry and it becomes hard to distinguish any particular, all the sort of old divisions fall away.
When some of the plutocrats, like Andrew Carnegie, he built libraries all across the country, and a lot of the robber barons did do philanthropic things such as that. Was that an influence through the WASPs, do you think?
With Carnegie, I don't know, because he had his own very distinct Scottish heritage, which was always interested in culting the mind and the spirit, and I think he always looked upon making money as a means to do something larger in the world. So I think Carnegie might be somewhat of a separate case. I think the Vanderbilts, for instance, they helped build the New York Metropolitan Opera House and things like that. But they were doing that probably partly because that's the way they moved into society. So there you really do have a case of where you're emulating the old Brahmin and New York elites, the pre-Civil War elites, who did sponsor museums and music houses, things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because there is a dichotomy there. You have the same end of having something like an opera house or something that's broader use, but kind of what the motivation for that is seems to be coming from different places.
Yes. You look at Isabel Stewart Gardner. She was originally from New York, but married into an old Boston Brahmin family. And she definitely liked to make a stir in the world, which led her to be somewhat resented or snubbed at the beginning by old Bostonians. But she also did she felt that the life she was leading was too narrow, stifling. She was good friends with Henry James and would complain about going back to Boston was just to go back to a city where she had no resources at all, where she was just not doing justice to whatever was in her power. So she is inspired by Venice and decides she'll build this Venetian-style museum in Boston and bring all this art there. And that's, in fact, it's the Gardner Museum today. And that really is a example of this kind of WASP idea of building an institution, but also to satisfy some longing or need in your own soul, your own mind. Actually, the good Henry James, who was not technically a WASP either, but was very close to he was friends with Henry Adams, Theodore Roosevelt, Isabella Stewart Gardner. But in his fiction, he depicts a character that feels confined, isn't living life, is just sort of looking at it, not getting out of it what he feels he should be. And in many of James's stories, this character, like Lambert Strether in The Ambassadors, doesn't break out of his cage, but he is getting at that WASP desire to find a way to break out of the cage and really realize some higher idea of what life's about.
Did some of the higher education institutions, did they curry and develop this ideal? Well,
there was actually sort of a great fight at Harvard, which is sort of one of the preeminent WASP universities. Harvard was being transformed from the old Harvard College that Henry Adams knew. It was being transformed by its president, Charles Eliot, into a major research university. And WASPs and other Harvard teachers like George Santayana, who were really committed to the old college ideal, where the professor is a teacher first, helping young people to find out who they are. They felt this was being destroyed by Eliot as he made it into a research university where the main part of the professor's time is spent in research and finding things out, and teaching is maybe left to graduate students. So at Harvard, there was a great struggle as people like Santayana and John J. Chapman and other people committed to the old ideal of the college as a tool for enlarging the minds of young people becomes a great world research center. One of the after effects of this Harvard humanism of Santayana and Isabel Stewart Gardner's friend, his name's escaping me right now, but one of the legacies there was it was carried on at Columbia, where they started in the 19-teens a core curriculum where students, it would be a mentoring class where students would just read great works of literature in a small group with a teacher, with the idea of broadening their horizons, not just mastering some lessons. So that was one institution where this WASP, I would call it WASP humanism, bore fruit.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I think it's so interesting that you bring this up because I've been researching and looking into classical education a lot more. And it's a very different style of learning that it's definitely meant to widen horizons, not just master a skill.
No, that's right. I think it really, Santayana said it's too bad that Harvard was ceasing to be a place where teachers would meet the students out of the classroom. And that's where a lot of the most important education actually went on. Santayana's rooms at Harvard he sort of conducted a informal seminar in the humanities with his students. And that was something that began to disappear. Oh, it was Charles Eliot Norton, I'm sorry, who was the Harvard eminence I was thinking of, who had a huge effect on the Harvard humanities, but was looked upon as sort of outmoded by Charles Eliot.
I was reading a book and it drew a really clear distinction between Harvard's divinity school and what they called the yard, where all the rest, and I mean, physically, they're even separated by quite a distance, the divinity school and the rest of Harvard. Was there any drive in the divinity school or any of the specific schools to keep more of the old school, if you will, ideal of Harvard going?
I think Santayana felt that anything that wasn't in the yard was not really Harvard anymore. He said, when he was asked about it later, he was one of the greatest teachers there, but he left around the age of 50, right before World War I broke out, and spent the rest of his life in Europe. He didn't go back for the 300th anniversary in 1636. And when people would ask him about it, he said, I don't know, I don't recognize this new Harvard with the different schools. I don't think he felt that the Divinity School was particularly carrying it on any better. He certainly didn't see it in the business school and professional schools. He said, I knew Harvard Yard, and I can't speak about what he called the chaotic and multifarious university that President Eliot created there.
Maybe we can start talking about some of the specific people. Were there maybe one that stuck out with me was John J. Chapman, but there was so many other. I mean, that's the bulk of the book is so many biographies, and I love learning about specific people. Were there some of the specific people that you wrote about that really stuck with you?
Well, I think Chapman is interesting because he embodied the real crisis that we've been talking about it sort of as in an abstract sense. You grow up as a young person, you're descended from families. He was descended from Chief Justice John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States. They grow up with these ideals that they find after the Civil War completely outmoded. The old civic idea of, you're a lawyer, but you're also a leader in your community. You cultivate interests in the arts, things like that. It's easy to speak of this on an abstract level, but Chapman was a really brilliant man. Gore Vidal says that he was the best essayist the United States ever produced. Edmund Wilson, the critic, said that he was almost certainly the greatest letter writer the United States has ever produced. He felt this acutely. He was at Harvard. He was in the Porcellian Club, but he broke down while he was attending the law school. He was reading Dante in his spare time, and he had a great crisis. And at the peak of it, he holds his hand to the fire in his room and essentially burns it off. It was amputated. And he comes out of that sort of changed and, with the idea that he is going to try and do something with his life. And he did. He became a civic reformer in New York and was instrumental in the early phases of Theodore Roosevelt's political career. And he really pursued both his interest in political reform and his interests in preserving, he wanted America to have he was afraid it was just becoming to resemble a big railway station rather than a real civilization with the kind of culture that can have an effect on people and enlarge their horizons. But he would be very much, he embodied the real crisis of that Gilded Age, the 1870s and 80s for some of the WASP reformers. Theodore Roosevelt watched his brother, Eliot, as I think we talked about, drink himself to death in his club. And Theodore Roosevelt, too, was trying to escape the sort of despair or lack of purpose or malaise or whatever you would call it. They called it neurasthenia, was their word for it, that was leading to these really botched lives. And John J. Chapman was one of them. George Cabot Lodge, the poet, was another one. Henry Adams, too. There was a personal despair or a personal sense of being ill at ease in their country that really drove them to want to reform it.
Some of these problems, like the neurasthenia that you spoke of, and I mean, we can't diagnose people, 100 years later, and I'm certainly not a psychologist, so I couldn't diagnose somebody. But where do you think that came from, that it led to almost mental breakdowns with so many of these people?
Yes, I think it's partly the other factor of the equation is these people are well off. So the difference between, they didn't have to, if they weren't feeling great, they didn't have to go to the job anyway. They had a lot of time to reflect on their problems, and that probably did play some role in their breakdowns. Being a leisured class with no purpose is hard work in its own way, they found, and that's why they were determined, particularly in a case like Theodore Roosevelt. He was not going to be like his brother and have nothing to do. He had enough money that he could spend his days, lounging around or, sailing a boat. But no, he's doing all things. He's writing books. He's going out west. He's entering politics. He's studying, writing about warfare. He's a real Athenian multitasker in the modern age. But he always said, this is the way he who moves fast enough or rides fast enough escapes what he called black care, meaning dark moods and neurasthenia and that sort of breakdown. And it's interesting, it had an effect, of course, because Eliot's daughter is Eleanor Roosevelt. So she had this, seeing both her parents die when she was a girl, dying very dismal deaths. And it had a huge impact on her view of life, what a corrosive acid leisure with no purpose can be. So she became extravagantly purposeful in her own existence.
It is so interesting that there were so many people, like you said, Theodore Roosevelt's brother, who could, and Theodore Roosevelt himself could have lived this life of luxury. Is that, as we're getting towards the end of the WASP phase, is it that people are who had that opportunity, is it that they don't have the opportunity as much anymore to live a leisure life? Or the people who do have that ability to, basically, they're rich enough to not have to do anything, they're not applying themselves in the way that some of the people like Theodore Roosevelt or Eleanor Roosevelt did?
Well, the tax laws, when Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal wealth tax came in, that did change the equation for a lot of WASPs. They didn't have the same amount of capital either to lounge around or, though, to pursue the public service careers that underwrote Franklin Roosevelt's his own public career. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt very rarely worked at a 9-to-5 job. He practiced law for a few years, and that was really about it. He had the ability through his mother's fortune to spend his life in public service for the most part. So that became less possible after the Second World War. And that too probably did have something to do with the demise of the WASPs as a class. If they didn't have the same money they could to just sit around all day, they also didn't have the same amount of capital that would allow them to pursue public service without making a lot of sacrifices.
I mean, looking at today, there certainly are plenty of people who have tons and tons of wealth, but they don't seem to be applying it in the same way that a lot of these people you talk about in the book. What do you think might be some of the differences between today and, and times past?
I think today's elites are more products of the sort of technocracy and specialization that the WASPs didn't like and were able to sort of avoid, in part with their own inherited capital, which wasn't taxed in the way it would be today, but also in part because they did create these institutions that really taught you that it's not enough just to make a fortune or be a great technocratic specialist. Once you've done that, you really should use that in some way to make a civic contribution. I don't think the idea is completely dead, but today the path is different, because if you grow up specializing, it's then very hard later in life, after you've done that, to recover that broader vision. I think Carnegie was the one that bore witness to that. We were talking about, he always wanted to make money so he could go out and do good in the world. And as soon as he had money, his idea was that he himself would, write books and sort of, elaborate a philosophy that would help the world. But he sort of came to see that after having spent most of his life running factories, that his mind just wasn't there quite for that kind of work. So what he did was created a foundation where he hired other people who weren't who were younger and were devoted to intellectual and philosophical pursuits to run it, and could realize some of the ambitions that he'd had when he was young, but had not been able to pursue because he had to go out and make a living.
Do you see any group or any people today who exhibit some of those characteristics of the WASPs?
Well, I think Bill Gates, for example, has tried very hard to put his fortune and his expertise to solving problems, malaria in Africa, or trying to help with our response to COVID. I think that I would say in somebody like Bill Gates that some of that aspiration remains. I would say, on the other hand, technocratic wealth and success of Silicon Valley seems to me to be quite far removed from the humane vision of the WASPs as this sort of cultivating the different parts of your nature. It seems much more caught up in, who will build the next rocket ship, which may be very valuable, but it's a very different ethic from that which Franklin Roosevelt grew up with.
Yeah, it seems like somebody like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, they're always trying to apply a technical knowledge to solving a specific problem. And it isn't this global idea of, what can I do to be a better person, build a better society? It seems more specific.
Technocrats, and maybe for good reason, are contemptuous of the amateurness of the old civic vision. They might say, well, how does this pursuit of some elusive civic good, what does that really compare to the technical expertise that builds a better machine, that feeds more people, that that makes a better medicine? That these are the real breakthroughs that are going to change humanity, and that we need specialists who can do that kind of work. And so that the person who spends their life as a dilettante, touching public service here and reading Plato or Dante there, is really not contributing to real tangible good. And there's something to be said for that. There's a whole debate to go on as to what is the role of what the WASPs were really doing, was trying to carry on a humane tradition that dates back to pre-modern societies. You see it in the Renaissance or in the Greek city-states. And the question is that an outmoded vision now? The Greek city-states were much smaller. They didn't have the sort of complex economies we do. They needed people to multitask. The argument could be made that what we really need is specialization, that we need people that are studying the hard disciplines, science, math, and technology, and not dithering around with Dante.
I can understand the need for technical skill, but it just seems like it's maybe something that we're lacking in society, of the person who's well-read and who can speak to a lot of different issues. It's kind of a depth or soul almost. It's hard to put words on it exactly, but that set of characteristics of somebody who doesn't just know how to do differential equations and apply that to designing the newest computer, but somebody who knows Dante and who knows, and it could even go across cultures too. And that's, maybe that is the next step, but just somebody who has a richness of knowledge.
Yes, I think particularly cross-cultural. The WASPs were more familiar with the Western tradition, but it really applies to all kinds of pre-modern civilizations that were, Confucius, that had a sort of a broader souled idea of what it takes to lead a fulfilling life. But on the other hand, if you're a young person today going out thinking about what you should study to get on in the world and have a chance to succeed enough in life to be able to make some larger difference later on, it's going to be the technical stuff that's going to help you. Your early jobs are going to be, you're going to be mastering fairly narrow sets of skills, whether you sort of whatever you're going into. There really isn't there isn't a market for that kind of ability today. Even in university, scholars are now, that we would like to maybe think of as the last holdout for the humane vision, because scholars, they don't have to make their money in the market. If they have tenure, they're free to study what they like and all of that. But the pressure in academia is to specialize in some very narrow areas. So you get people that are brilliant in a particular field, but because they're so narrowly ensconced in that field, they often do lose the bigger picture.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. and so much drive for deliverables. What is the end goal here, and how can we measure that goal, and how can we measure progress? That's hard to say on somebody who's just well-read and knowledgeable and thinks about issues.
That's right. You have to show. This was in the whole debate at Columbia, which we were talking about. They did establish their core curriculum where you would spend 4 years. The large part of your study would be classics of literature, art, philosophy, music. But there had been a debate before that where Columbia thought about abolishing Columbia College altogether because it didn't, the humane education already in the late 19th century, a lot of the Columbia trustees and leaders were, as their word was, it didn't show results. You wanted to have data to prove that your scholars were actually producing something tangible, which you're not producing something tangible in a great books course.
You use a lot of quotes from characters from literature to kind of illustrate the motives, opinions, the ethos of the WASPs. What fictional books do you think you would recommend for people that could really help us, maybe understand the WASPs more?
For popular fiction, I think Louis Auchincloss's The Wrecker of Justin, which describes a school based on his own school, Groton, gives you some of the atmosphere and the drive with the headmaster really trying to reach his students and hoping that he would persuade them to lead lives of civic purpose, and then becoming very disillusioned at the end when most of them just become stockbrokers and corporation lawyers. I think Henry Adams's book, The Education of Henry Adams, is the great classic book on the aspirations, the failures, the whole crisis of that produced the WASPs as a class. Although Adams phrases it so ironically that if you read it literally, you'll miss a lot of what he's trying to get across. He doesn't say any of this quite as he doesn't make it explicit. You have to sort of work with his irony. But it's one of the great classic. For years, it was the #1 book on, I think, the Modern Library's list of the 100 best modern nonfiction books. Though I should say he was a flawed character too. There's the other side of the WASPs. Their snobbishness, their exclusivity, all that's very trying as you read it. And it's certainly there in many ways in Henry Adams. So I think we haven't talked about that. We've been talking about how sort of broad-souled they were, but they weren't broadly inclusive in their institutions until after the Second World War. They were very much keeping it within their crowd.
How has that kind of changed that mentality? Because, we still hear some stories about clubs and golf clubs, and even up until today, but certainly and more so in the past, they've started to fade out in maybe the last 25, 30 years. What was the mentality that came from that they were in so many ways broad, but like you said, they narrowed in not letting people into their golf clubs and not into beach clubs and that sort of thing?
One thing was power. The WASPs, they really, as we said, they sort of felt they were being left out in the cold when new elites were emerging after the Civil War. So they had this revival, but it was based partly on connections. You keep it within your group so you can, your son will, if you had a good career, you can assure your son will be kind of well set up too. And you do that by keeping other people out. So your son goes into the law firm you work for or your friend's law firm, and you marry, the families become intermarried, they work for the same firms, they know the same people. When they go into government, whom does Franklin Roosevelt have for some of his big jobs? His fellow schoolmates, people who went to his school, Averell Harriman, Dean Acheson, Sumner Wells. And that was a way to preserve their power. Once you become a pure or much purer meritocracy, that goes away. You can't just pass power on to your friends and keep it in the family or in the tribe.
And so many times the WASPs, they would set up institutions to help the poor and help new immigrants, but it almost seemed like they had disdain for them as well. It seemed like kind of a push and a pull that they certainly weren't going to invite these, these people to their parties, but they were helping them.
It's an interesting dynamic. I mean, you look at a lot of young WASPs, their conscience, Eleanor Roosevelt, Vita Scudder, these young women were appalled by the suffering and the poverty they found in urban slums. But you see they created these settlement houses in Boston and New York and other cities, in Chicago, Hull House, Jane Addams, that would be a psychic boost for poor neighborhoods, that would bring them into touch with other ideas of culture, as well as giving them real assistance in terms of food and clothing and things like that, but also was meant to be a cultural boost. And they formed even a league to promote settlement houses. And this became the Junior League for the promotion of settlement houses. But the Junior League, in the end, becomes just another sort of, well, I shouldn't disdain it, but it becomes sort of a social thing as much as a philanthropic thing. And you see the sort of cross purposes there.
Vita Scudder was one that I found really interesting because I have a lot of interest in the history of religion as well. And she, I guess saint might not be the right word, but she's on the calendar of veneration of the Episcopal Church. How did that happen? She's an interesting, she was caught up in the guilt that a lot of WASPs felt when they looked at for the first time, they became much more conscious that they were privileged and that other people were shut out of it. So she took a lead in some of this settlement house philanthropy. At the same time, she was both a devout Christian and a devout socialist, which was an interesting combination. She was hoping that somebody would emerge the way Aquinas used Aristotle, reconciled Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology to produce a comprehensive view of the world. That was her hope, was that somebody would emerge that would be able to synthesize St. Francis with Karl Marx. And so Vita Scudder is at once this quintessential WASP who taught for years at Wellesley, and at the same time quite a social radical who would address the textile workers in Lowell, Massachusetts. Would you say that Christian socialism that was a big part of the progressive movement of the late 19th going into the early 20th century, did that have a strong WASP connection? Yes, a lot of the Christian socialism meant different things to different people. Vita Scudder carried it much farther than, for instance, Kingsley and Frederick Maurice in England. His socialism, that socialism which influenced Endicott Peabody, the founder of Groton, was not like Vita Scudder's. It was not to replace capitalism or private property. It was more to soften it and humanize it. So when you talk about the social gospel movement or some of the Christian socialist movements, there's a real disparity between those that are really going in a thoroughgoing Marxist direction and those which are more about humanizing capitalism, which is, I think, where most of the WASPs were. Vita was sort of an outlier in being more radical than most. Eleanor Roosevelt maybe too, but not Franklin Roosevelt or Theodore Roosevelt. They weren't socialists. I like to wrap up these conversations, this being beyond the big screen. Is there any depiction of a WASP from popular culture, maybe the television or a movie or film, that you think kind of grasps what a WASP is? With the fall of the WASPs and the stock character in popular culture is of a sort of Thurston Howell sort of joke. I don't know that there's been a sympathetic popular portrait of, but I don't keep up with a lot of the
current movies. I don't know what's out there now. But I think for people my age watching television when we were young, I mean, Thurston Howell would be the image that comes to mind when you think of a wasp, the lockjawed accent and all of that.
Do you think in large part with, like you said, with the bushes, do you think that, and with your book, that we can see the wasps through a more sympathetic light?
I hope it would both show their strengths and weaknesses. I wouldn't carry nostalgia too far for them. As a class, I think their privilege really was in many ways indefensible. I would think that their ideas, not because they were WASP ideas, but just because, as we were saying, they are really about what's the point of being alive? What do you do with this life you have? What powers are in you, and are you doing justice to them? Are you? I think that debate about those kinds of things. What is the way to live a fulfilling, complete life? I think that's a question that we could use more debate on and could address more deeply. It was very much at the heart of Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. But I don't know that, especially with social media, we seem going in the other direction of becoming ever more narrow in our preoccupations, losing what common life we had as we become absorbed in our phones and TikTok and all of that. And as our careers become more microscopically specialized as well. So I think that WASP idea that it's at least a question to ask wherever you come out on it is would be what I would hope to get across with the book. Not that the WASPs themselves were any sort of perfect models for our emulation.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. A huge thanks goes out to Michael Knox Beran and his book, WASPs, The Splendors and Miseries of an American Aristocracy. Links to learn more about how to find Michael Beran Knox and his book, WASPs, can be found at simonandschuster.com or in the show notes. I would definitely appreciate it if you left a rating and review on iTunes or your podcatcher of choice. If you'd like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, you can go to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. There you can follow us on social media, or just by searching for A2Z History Page in the various social media outlets. If you ever have a question, you can always send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. You can let me know about people who might make great guests, great books, great movies, or just great topics. I'd love to hear all of your suggestions and thoughts. And with that, I will see you next time beyond the big screen.